Good evening. My name is Tom Kohler. I'm here in Thunderbolt, Georgia, which is right outside of Savannah, Georgia. We are just up beyond Florida in the United States. And I've been asked by Alex Davidson to talk a little bit about my personal history and the idea of citizen advocacy, and to talk about the work that I do through the organization Chatham Savannah Citizen Advocacy. And I'm honored and happy to do that. Just to say that I got interested in people with disabilities when I was 15 years old through a voluntary experience. I had thought I was going to be an advertising executive up until then, but I met a 15-year-old young man who needed some help with some physical therapy, and I volunteered to do that, and that sort of changed the direction that I was personally going in my life. I spent a few years after that working in human services, always the youngest person in the room, so to speak. But by my early 20s, had become discouraged with organized human services for several reasons. One reason I had become discouraged was that I had begun to realize that we had a bad habit of keeping people separate from other people, and we had a really bad habit of having very low expectations in terms of what people could and couldn't do. I was ready to leave the field, if you will, and then I met some folks who had a different way of looking at the world, and their way of looking at the world, simply stated, was that most of us had been taught to think that people were broken and needed to be fixed. A deficiency view of the world and of people. They had a different perspective, which was that the world had a deep crack in it, and that crack needed to be sewn back together. Their idea was that one way to sew the crack back together, so to speak, was through relationship building, and particularly building relationships between people who lived on what I've come to call thick ice, people who live in the safe center of culture and community, and people who live on thin ice, people who have been pushed to the margins, to the edge, and many times to the bottom of culture and community. So the work that I've done for almost 40 years now through the citizen advocacy model is work that involves asking individual people to think about themselves and to think about how they fit into our community, Savannah, and what type of community they believe they want to live in, and then to think about or consider the idea of personally aligning themselves with one individual person who has been pushed to the edge and maybe down because of prejudice toward disability, and entering into a relationship where both people have something to give and both people have something to gain. And that has kept me pretty interested for a very long time. In the mid 1970s in the United States, there was a movement to challenge the power and the importance of the institutions. And a man named Wolf Wilsonberger was central to that challenge of the power of institutions. He did some of the very first work in the United States, bringing people back out of the state institutions and back into their home communities, and he did that work in Omaha, Nebraska. One of the things that Wolf noticed was that although people had come back into their own communities, had been brought back from the big state institution, that they were closer at hand, if you will, to their home community, but they were no closer in heart or at heart to people who lived in the community. So he felt like there needed to be a mechanism that would intentionally bring people closer to one another and ask people to intentionally think about forming relationships with people who have been excluded, marginalized, if you will. So that was one of his rationales. The other was that he came to believe that all systems, not just the big bad evil institutional system, but that all systems had certain biases and had certain limitations, and that it would be important to have an independent, freestanding, voluntary person who was free from conflict of interest, connected to an individual person who depended on a system for their daily life and for their care. The third thing that Wolf believed was that or question that he was trying to answer was parents would come up to him at conferences and that sort of thing, as I understand it, and ask him the age-old question, which is, what'll happen to my child when I die? And he imagined and conceptualized, if you will, citizen advocacy really based on these three experiences. One, people coming back from the state institutions into their home communities but not being very well welcomed as people. The idea that all systems need to be monitored from the outside by people who are free from conflict of interest. And the third leg on the stool was this idea that as people's parents aged, it would be important to have other people in the communities who knew the people and had an intention to be concerned about and be involved with them over long periods of time. In Georgia, we chose to use citizen advocacy as an approach, as a response to the federal government's, the United States government's mandate that every state, all 50 states in Georgia, have what was called a Protection and Advocacy Office. In 49 states, those turned out to be primarily legal advocacy organizations. In Georgia, a different decision was made, and so the idea was to invest in citizen advocacy. And so we started in 1978 and with a clear commitment to invite Georgians, tax-paying Georgians, citizens, to step closer to people that had been pushed aside and to use their citizenship muscles, their common sense, their passion, and their persistence on behalf of individual people. Early in that planning, there was the belief, the understanding that if people couldn't see one another as equals, or if people couldn't find the humanity in one another, it really wouldn't matter how many lawyers were hired, it wouldn't matter how many caseworkers were hired, it wouldn't matter how many regulations were put in place, that the real challenge and opportunity was for people to find ways to, rather than see each other as the other, to begin to find ways to see one another as brother. And so, again, the idea of relationship building built right in to the idea of protecting people and advocating for people. It's interesting that many people who have a disability are seen sometimes in three very familiar ways. One way people are seen sometimes is a problem, and many times that's kind of a social worker's perception, because you go see the social worker when you have a problem. In the United States, sometimes people are seen as a project. A Sunday school class will be invited to adopt someone and help someone in a way, and so that's kind of the Sunday school class's project is a person's need. And then the other way that people get seen is as patients, because the medical model continues to be so strong. I mean, in citizen advocacy, we're just asking people to try to find ways to see one another as people. And so we try to be really careful with our language and with our thinking to avoid, for example, the word client. We talk about people, and we talk about citizens, and we talk about this idea of being able to see ourselves in the other person, if you will. Early on in Georgia, we committed ourselves to the idea that there would be small, independent citizen advocacy offices in several cities around the state, and there would be a central office in Atlanta, the big city in Georgia, the Georgia Advocacy Office, that would help get those offices started, and then gradually they would gain local support and support themselves. So for the past 40 years, that's really been the work we've done in Savannah. We've developed strong local support base to support the organization financially. We've, over the past 40 years, made about 800 matches. Of those 800, about 110 are ongoing, and that's been sort of a steady number over time. And then we've had thousands and thousands of stories of local people finding ways to be responsive and be responsible to one another through this idea called citizen advocacy. You know, there are many different ways you can think about getting people involved. We've chosen a very direct method, which is we use what we call trust networks. People that we know and trust introduce us to people that they know and trust. And we recruit advocates through that framework of personal contact and an ever-growing web of people, that people that we know then introduce us to people that they know. In broad terms, we're looking for people who have compassion and backbone. We're looking for people who are proactive in nature, and we're looking for people that have an empathetic imagination. We're looking for people that want Savannah to be a better place and to be a better place for everyone. And we're looking for people who like and believe in the idea that they as individual people can make a difference by aligning themselves with the interest of one other person, and then those two people together trying to be creative and committed to each other's best interests over a long period of time. So we are relationship builders, and we do that one match, one connection, one match at a time. We try to look for people who have developmental disabilities. We're usually in tough situations, not always, but usually. And for us, tough situations mean people who are at risk of or are being abused or neglected, or people who are having to endure life-defining segregation, or people that are being moved from place to place to place to place whose lives are really chaotic. And so we try to consciously and intentionally go and look for people and learn about people who are living what we consider to be pretty tough lives. What we discover, of course, is that there's always beauty in the person, and the person themselves is always interesting and more complicated than maybe their surroundings make it easy for you to understand at first. And so, as advocate once said, they said, "I've met a really beautiful person who lives in a really ugly place." And that many times is the experience that an advocate has. They discover they've met a really beautiful person whose life, unfortunately, because of, again, our prejudice toward disability, whose life may not be very pretty. You know, it's interesting because when we tell stories and we measure, if you will, we think about citizen advocacy, at least in our world, we think about it mostly through story rather than data or statistics. I mean, we we keep some data, we keep a few statistics, but really it's about stories. And some of the stories are easy to understand because there's stories about a person who meets someone, and they, as they get to know the person, they identify an opportunity, and they go out and they create the opportunity, and then that unfolds and something good happens for somebody. Somebody gets a job. So, for example, it's fun to tell a story about Bubba Lowenthal, who met a man named Billy Glisson, and Bill was looking for work and had been unsuccessful finding work. And then the way Bubba approached that was he went back through his high school annual. He grew up in Savannah. He looked through his high school annual. He began making a list of people he went to high school with who owned their own businesses. And then he started calling his old high school buddies and talking with them and finding out about their businesses. And then as he began to learn that, he and Billy started going to visit, and then that was the way Billy got his first job. Was Bubba had a friend who was owned a concrete business. Billy got a job working in the concrete business. So that's a pretty easy story to tell. It's about one person helping somebody find a job by using their network. So that's a pretty easy story to tell. It's harder to tell a story where not much changes in the person's life except the most important thing. And the most important thing that changes is the person knows that someone has come to love them, that someone has come to take them seriously. And those stories are a little bit harder to tell because those stories are really very much stories of the heart rather than stories of the landscape, so to speak. So another type of story that people find, I think, hard to think about, but we consider valuable stories, are stories where the advocate really bears witness to suffering. Because there are situations, there are times when the playing field is so tilted, the deck is so stacked against someone that no matter really how hard the advocate tries, sometimes no matter how many other people they get involved to try to help make an accomplishment or keep something really bad from happening, things don't work out very well. And when that happens, really the challenge is for the advocate to not run, because it's human nature. If we don't feel like we've, quote, done a good job, or if we don't feel like, quote, we've succeeded, a lot of times we retreat and run away to save our own ego. So we value stories where the person that we call the advocate stands and bears witness sometimes to suffering. And because I think when a person is hopeless is when they realize that no one even notices the situation that they're in. We also have stories of people adopting people, and those are easy stories to tell because people understand how important it is for children, all children, to live inside a family. And we've been able to find adoptive families for several children over the years. And we also, of course, love telling stories where advocates figure out how to sort of cut through the red tape of the American bureaucracy and actually get something good to happen for someone using the public benefits system. A man named Sheldon Tenenbaum, for example, many years ago, teamed up with a man named Gary Foss, and the two of them worked really hard to change Medicaid policy in the state of Georgia so that Gary would have the kind of support services he would need to be able to live in his own apartment rather than live in the nursing home he'd been put in. And so that would be an example of spokesmanship and an example of red tape cutting, where the advocate used his own political and business connections to really work up into the high levels of state government to push for change. One of the stories that I look back and still sort of marvel at happened pretty early on. A man named Cletus Bergen was connected with a man named Sam Benjamin, and Sam was living in a nursing home at the time. It turned out that Mr. Benjamin did have family. His family, unfortunately, lived in a little four-room shack that didn't have running water or electricity at the time, and so his mother lived with his lived with his five nieces and nephews that his mother was taking care of. Mr. Bergen realized that he couldn't protect Sammy in the nursing home, that no matter how often he visited, bad things kept happening. And so he also began to realize that the family wasn't going to be able to take Sammy back in given their living conditions. And so over a period of about 5 years, he organized over 300 people and raised some money and built a house for Mr. Benjamin and the family. And Sammy was able to move back in. The volunteers that Mr. Bergen was able to organize and involve included architects. A man named John Mandrala drew the plans for the house and acted as the general contractor. The vocational technical school in Savannah got involved and did the plumbing and the brickwork and that kind of thing. A church, Speedwell United Methodist Church, painted the house. An insurance man who was a friend of Cleats pushed a local bank to do a low interest loan, and so it was pretty exciting to watch step by step, with no sense of what was possible, to see something happen that you might have never imagined that would be possible, to see the impossible actually turn out to be possible. That was pretty exciting, very exciting, and I think opened up this idea that individual people, particularly if they invite other people to go on the journey with them, can do really powerful things. Citizen advocacy, like everything, evolves and changes over time. Our core principles, our rationales, our definition have held steady over time. But with that said, we do evolve, and we do try to think about what's the future look like. For us, there are a few things that we're thinking about right now. One thing we're thinking about are two questions, and one question is a question that we've asked and answered, which is, what can people come to mean to one another? And that question is a question that allows us to think about the relationships that people build between one another. What can people come to mean to one another? A second question that is a much more emergent question for us is, what can people come to mean to the common good? And when you ask that question, it suggests that the person we would call the advocate and the person we would call the protege, if they can begin to think of themselves as civic pioneers and together look for ways to do things that people in the community have not imagined that someone who has this label of disability would participate in. So the idea here would be to see if two people could find ways that they together could participate and contribute to the quality, for example, of civic life, or to the quality of religious life, or to the quality of neighborhood life. So with the hope that people would begin to notice that a person who has traditionally been thought of, at least in American language, as a consumer, or as a client would then become someone who would be thought of as a contributor and as a citizen. And if we're trying to protect people, the most important thing we need to protect is their image and their status in our communities. And so helping people shift their image and status away from client and consumer and toward citizen and contributor, with this idea of two people imagining themselves as civic pioneers, for us, that's sort of an emergent future for citizen advocacy. I would like to say in closing that, again, I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you, and I travel for cheap. Thanks so much.